Everyone knows the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. But have we ever stopped to ask why? Why is that in there? Why was he weeping? Have you gone and read the story? Because it's actually very impactful. Not just the story itself, but just what it signifies. Jesus didn't cry because he was weak. He cried because he cared, because he saw a broken world and broken people crushed under the weight of sin and death and just human suffering and empire. And that same Jesus, the one who wept, he's also the one who flipped tables and defied corrupt authority and corrupt power and called out hypocrisy to its face. Tonight, I'm joined by Ben Weir, founders of Punks for Liberty, to talk about the radical, countercultural Jesus who didn't fit in with the empire of his day and what that means for Christians who refuse to fit in with ours.
If Christ is king, how should the Christian consider the kingdoms of this world? What does the Bible teach us about human authority and what it means to love our neighbors and our enemies? Before we render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, let's know what it means to render unto God what is God's. This is the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, the modern prophetic voice against war and empire.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Biblical Anarchy Podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Winograd. As I said in the intro, I'm going to be joined today by Ben Weir, a good friend of mine, founders of Punks for Liberty, a libertarian activist, also a recent new father. And we're going to have a lot of fun with today's conversation. I'm going to go ahead and bring him in now. Ben, thanks for joining me today. Sorry, we had a little bit of a late start and reschedule a couple times, but I'm glad to be here with you. I can't believe, so I've been on your show, I think at least once. This is your first time on my show here at LCI. I know you were a fellow Christian and a fellow ANCAP. Go ahead and introduce yourself to my audience for those who are unfamiliar with you, and just give a little, any things that you think are relevant and interesting about your background as a Christian and a libertarian.
So my name is Ben Weir, and I've been a Christian, I'd say, for most of my life. I think I probably truly got saved when I was more like a late teenager years. Spent a couple years as like a missionary. I was in the military. I'm a veteran in the infantry. And then I spent about 10 years after being in the military touring in a band, playing a lot of shows. And my first band was actually like a Christian pop punk band. And we got to play a lot of like big Christian music festivals. That was fun. It progressed into more of a, we always said like, we're not a Christian band, we're Christians in a band type of thing. And we had a lot of good messages in our music. That was fun. And eventually 2020 came around, COVID shut all the venues down, and that part of my life ended. I was a career man at this point. I moved across the country to New Hampshire. I started Punks for Liberty. I've been involved also with the Libertarian Party for way too long, and that's coming to an end. Some of it already has. And from this point, I am just, spreading the love of God through my actions in life, and also just returning to my full-fledged anarchist roots. I have been an anarchist pretty much my entire life, and I believe that's what God intended for us. And I like to encourage that message of love and peace through that lens. So,
yeah, it's funny. We could, on a separate episode, maybe it could be like a bonus episode for my supporters or yours, because I don't know if it's necessarily one we want to have out there just in the wild, but we could probably do a really fun episode just like swapping, like war stories about just all the stupid drama and just not really like horrific in a sense of like it being actually traumatic, but horrific in just in terms of like the time suck and just emotional drain that is doing things within the Libertarian Party. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about more fun things. You mentioned being an anarchist, which of course, so most of LCI, I'd say like 80% of it is anarchist, ANCAP, but they're kind of like more of the, to use a Christian term here, seeker sensitive types. Whereas I'm kind of like the more like, it's just in my name. I'm just like, no, like biblical anarchy. Let's just address the elephant in the room, right? We're going to put the word anarchy right out there in the open and just force the conversation from the get-go. So like when people from my church find out I have a podcast, I tell them the name. It's usually like, and then do the awkward pause, and then I have to start filling the silence to, so if you were in that position, right, the awkward pause after you say you're an anarchist, how do you explain anarchy to people? I think it'd be a good place to kind of start, because we're both anarchists, and yet we probably approach this in different ways, or maybe we don't. But I'd be interested to hear how you explain anarchy to someone who is like hearing that for the first time and probably has a lot of misconceptions and just ideas in their head about what that word means.
Yeah. So I don't know. Like for me, my previous Twitter handle was the emo ANCAP. That's no longer the case. I'm now Weir for Liberty. But, I think that when it comes to anarchism, I definitely align kind of more with like Michael Malice's idea of anarchism. I call myself now an anarchist without adjectives, similar to like he does the same thing. But it took me a while to kind of like really get what he was saying. And I totally get it. Anarcho-capitalism is where a lot of my views probably got me to. We align pretty much on everything. But, I think anarchism is just a rejection essentially of, imposed rulers and coercive hierarchy, basically. And for me, I kind of think that the term ANCAP is very limiting for what anarchism really encompasses. And a lot of people will kind of just throw it out there, and they'll call it like corporate anarchism or internet libertarianism, basically. And it's so much more than that. It's not a destination, it's a relationship. And in my opinion, I would much rather focus on brainstorming the perfect post-state society. I think it's a very utopian idea, and I don't think it's practical or possible in the current framework. I'm more interested in rejecting coercion, and just I think the biggest thing is recognizing individual autonomy and the ability to decide for yourself. I think that that's what God wants for us. I think that's our natural human state. And, I think that would probably sum up anarchism the best if I had to put something on it. But like I said,
right,
probably lean more agree with most ANCAPs. I just think that's very limiting. And I also think that the bigger issue I think I have a bit more recently is that it puts me into this new collectivism or collectivist type thing, where I'm in this group of elitist ANCAPs, and I don't think all of our ideas are perfect. And I feel like this idea hasn't been worked out of the way. This is why I say
right.
I'm not really interested in the utopian idea of brainstorming a post-state society that's in line with perfect anarchism. Does that make sense?
I think I get exactly what you're saying, and this will be insider baseball for maybe the uninitiated. But so I'm very much, I think, kind of what you said. I align a lot and resonate a lot with the anarcho-capitalist theory and writings. I've read Rothbard, I've read Hoppe, I've read Kinsella, I've even read some Walter Block, who isn't maybe my favorite ANCAP, but I think has some good ideas that he's talked about, at least food for thought in that realm. There's even modern ANCAPs who I've had some issues with, but I've come to respect more, like Liquid Zulu, who now where that gets a little off the rails is they get so much into this sort of world building, right, of what the anarcho-capitalist world looks like. And then there's this expression which comes from a guy who I don't like anymore, but it's useful, living in Ancapistan in your head, where you're just you're thinking well, an ANCAP society would have, X, Y, and Z. So, anyone who is advocating for anything less than this perfect utopian vision, that gets to this gatekeeping purity test thing. And that's not really...
It becomes a political tribe, basically.
Exactly.
And LP does the same thing. And this is why I don't want to say I reject it, because I feel as an anarchist, I think people can do what they want. But I just think it kind of outsources your morality to this other thing that it's not supposed to be. And, I just think people, comes down to think for yourself, reject authority, reject coercion, and have your individual autonomy. I think that even in our, especially in the libertarian circle, we've become part of this, there's so many different. It's so dumb too, because like there's so many different political tribes in the LP and among the ANCAPs and among anarchists. Kind of like tried to pull myself away from that a bit, because I think it's gotten, I've always talked about, my distaste for factionalism in the LP, but I think that like it just goes beyond that. Like it's so far past that.
It's funny. Like I don't like the factionalism, which doesn't mean I don't have an opinion. Like often, like
of course,
like I was with
people do not like my opinions.
Right.
Trust me.
Oftentimes, like there will be, I don't want to name names, but people who know will know that there's usually one faction within the LP space who I generally, like 8 or 9 out of 10 times, I agree with their opinion. But then when they're playing radical factionalism and infighting, it just kind of like loses me. And I'm just like, is it worth dying on these hills if not everyone else wants to do it? I am more of like a, even though I have my opinions, I do value consensus building and coalitioning more than I do the fighting and like political control. You brought up Michael Malice, and I think this is a useful way to kind of pivot and continue to define anarchy. He defines anarchy in a way that the first time I heard it, I thought it was so dumb. I thought it made no sense. And now I think it's brilliant. He says, anarchy just means one simple thing, that you don't speak for me.
And everything else is
just
commentary.
Everything else is just like fluff, or it's just like execution. It's just like, but he's right? Because like what the government does, even what oftentimes political parties do, and that's true for the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, and even the Libertarian Party, is they presume to speak for you. They presume that like, if you are part of this group, right, or if you're an American, right, then you must believe and do these things to maintain your part of this group. And if you don't, then you're going to be excommunicated, or if it's the state, right, if it's, statists doing it, then they're going to advocate for force or violence against you to like either say, we're going to make you agree with us, or there's going to be consequences for not agreeing with us. And so what anarchy would mean, like if everyone just kind of understood that I don't speak for anyone but myself, that would cut off that's like the root of sort of the anti-anarchist or the, pro-state, what we often will call statist paradigm, is that I can speak for you, that I can overcome your will, I can overcome your conscience, and I can use coercion and force to make you do what you would not freely consent to do, which is ultimately, I think, against not just a consistent libertarian ethic, but I think it's just against a consistent Christian ethic, a consistent Christ-like ethic, is that, we're called to be, fishers of men, which means that like, we're supposed to, like lure them in, we're supposed to persuade them. I believe that we don't convert people at all, that we preach the gospel and it's the Holy Spirit changing people's hearts and softening them to accept the gift of grace that, Christ purchased for them on the cross. Fear and coercion and violence, these things cannot produce a transformed heart. So to me, to use coercion to, like when we have people who are embracing what's called Christian nationalism. And to me, it's like, it's just like the biggest oxymoron, right? Like to say like, you're going to, I guess there's like a colloquial way where you could like, I want to live in a society that's Christian. Okay. But like, if you mean Christian nationalism, like, the government institution of Christian norms, you might as well be saying like, I want to have I don't know, like the fire company that produces water or something, right? It's just like right. It's a square circle. It doesn't exist.
Yeah, man. I mean, you nailed it with like the whole Christian nationalism thing. I think nationalism is definitely not, well, one, I don't think that we've ever been a truly like what people would describe as a Christian nation. They're saying, kind of like a return to tradition type mindset, but like things got pretty blurry there towards the beginning of things. It was not as pretty and everyone goes to church on Sunday as everyone pretends that it was. If you understand history, you'd understand that the history of even the church has been very violent, very full of sin, because we're all people. And, we have America. This is a great place. And I like that we can speak our opinions, but I'm thankful to live here. I just feel like, you know, the idea of having a Christian nation, it's also a utopian idea. It's not
Right.
possible, not practical. Well, of course it's practical because, you know, that's obviously, you know, when God takes us up to the kingdom, that's going to be
Well,
what
right.
we have there is it's not going to be,
That's
you
what
know,
the book of Hebrews says, right? Like in Hebrews 11, that
right.
like these shadows, the things of the Mosaic covenant, that even those who were living in that, they looked forward to a better promise that foretold of a better nation, right? The better
Yeah.
pointing to, you know, it's also called like the New Jerusalem, which is like, yeah, the new heavens and the new earth, you know, whether that's brand new or that's, you know, restoring what's old. The point is that like it's just like we're born again. I think that, you know, creation itself will be, you know, born again and, you know, washed clean of sin. And like that's, yeah, that'll be you could call it Christian nationalism of a sort, but you don't create it through an earthly kingdom, that's for sure.
I think it's been like really healthy for me. Like I said, I'm trying to like pull myself away from a lot of this, like a lot of the party politics right now and create a little bit of separation there so that I can go out and like just do what I do, like do my thing, what I think is like best to further liberty, you know, obviously through a Christian lens, but also, you know, through what's practical, what's possible right now, what can I affect directly in my world. So that's like my next step. And I've got like some pretty big plans coming up in the next couple months. But I think that has been really healthy for me to get away from a lot of this like political drama with the political party, with the LP, with all this stuff. I've been able to like kind of like see people and talk to people in a way that like I haven't been able to for probably a little while
Yeah.
because I feel like you get in this like mindset. You know, it's not like I was never like one of these like my way or the highway type of people, but I do think that like being around things and having things ingrained into you so much, it starts to like become something that you feel too. And I honestly think that like it kind of dehumanizes people a
Oh,
little bit to
absolutely.
like put them into this like political thing. Like this is all you are, is a political pawn. And no, these are humans and they deserve liberty. Sure. Like, how are we going to get there? Sure. That's another thing. They're also like God's creation. You know what I'm saying?
Well, it's like,
Like
how can we
these are like,
the way I would put it, because I agree 100% with what you're saying. And I think it's like, even when I was like, you know, doing stuff within the LP, you stop viewing people when you're in politics the way you should. Like we're supposed to try to view people in like the same way that the father would look at them. Like we're supposed to pray to have the heart of the father. And when you're in
yeah,
politics, and listen, like I think it's one of those things. In theory, Christians can serve in politics faithfully, but I think it takes like an exceptional like it takes like a you know a Ron Paul or a Thomas Massey, and even then, their job is probably not to really change the system from the inside, but to just kind of like be like Elijah and just like get up there and be like, all your gods are fake, right? Just be a truth teller.
yeah,
That's what Ron Paul was. That's what Massey does. That's what you know Rand at his best. Rand's had some bad moments, but Rand at his best has done that. I think there's like you know that's like the exception that proves the rule. That I think for the most part, a lot of us are better off.
you can be a truth teller and not be like one of these like elitist people who just basically like dehumanizes somebody, like I said, to the point that they're a political pawn. I think that
Yeah.
like this hardens a lot of people in the LP. It hardens their hearts. They decide, you know, as much as I've always said this too, but we're not good at talking to normal people. But I also think that now that I'm kind of like going back to where I've wanted to be for a while, I think that like going back to this mindset has helped me like actually understand how to talk to people again, like on a more real level. Cause I was already going out there trying to like talk to people with Punks for Liberty, going to festivals and shows, you know, pointing people in the direction, you know, that I think is pushing us towards like, you know, less government. And that's the goal. But I honestly think that the LP, or really if you get too involved with any political party or system, I think that is bad for your soul. And I think that that's not And I don't know why, man. I've literally preached this stuff forever, but I'm feeling it now.
Yeah.
I'm feeling like I'm able to understand like what my purpose on this earth is again by walking away from that and by being able to like see people as, you know, God's creation and not just some political pawn. I think that it's been really good for me, you know, spiritually and also, you know, just in general. Like I just think my overall mental health, everything has gotten a lot better. So
yeah, well, you
yeah,
brought up Punks for Liberty now, and I brought it up too a couple of times. But what is Punks for Liberty? Let's talk about that for a little bit. I think that's an avenue to talk about some other things we want to discuss on this episode. But what's the mission behind it? What inspired the creation for it? And we'll kind of go from there.
Yeah. So Punks for Liberty, you know, like I said, I spent about 10 years touring with my band. And when I was doing that, we used the stage as basically a pulpit. We had a mission and a message. And, you know, a lot of our work was suicide prevention and awareness. We were trying to help people. We had a bit of a liberty political message in there sometimes as well. But, you know, when you're on stage, people listen to what you have to say. Like they're there to have a good time. This is a community that, you know, it's actually very kind of like the LP. Like you probably all go there for the same purpose, which is to just have fun, listen to music and chill. But like, it doesn't matter if you disagree with the musician entirely or not. I mean, some cases you won't listen to them again, but you know, but you're on stage, they'll listen to you. I think that's a powerful place to be for people who identify as libertarians or anarchists or just freedom advocates in general. And you've seen this happening with a lot of bands out there. But one side of it is that I'm creating like a network of musicians and bands and artists so that if something like COVID happened again, where people almost lost their livelihood, some like major touring bands who almost weren't able to tour anymore or play shows because of all the lockdowns, well, they have like a community and a network that we can go through and maybe do some kind of like alternative system, kind of more of an agorist type approach, creating an alternative, you know, system there. But also, I think it's also been really cool because I've gone to shows, I've handed out literature, which I don't do as much literature anymore. I think the conversations have been more productive, but it's been really good to go out to shows and just like go outside and chill after the show and just like talk to people and see where they're at. Kind of like what we do with Christianity, where you're like an evangelist, right? I wouldn't call us like street preachers, but it is like liberty evangelism. It's kind of like, you know, almost like apologetics in a way. You know, you go up to people like, you know, oh, like, did you know that you're a sinner? Like, oh, did you know that there's a better way too, that we can live without the government and we can build other communities? So there's a lot of that goes on. And we are building like a volunteer base across the country, going to major festivals. And I think one of our goals for next year is to hopefully sponsor a tour of some sort and maybe go on a couple stops of that tour. This year, we have had presence at, I think, 5 or 6 major music festivals. And I've also was invited out to Midwest Peace and Liberty Festival as well, out in Michigan with those folks. They're great people. And I was able to talk out there and talk about like punk rock liberty and all that. So
yeah,
it's been really fun so far. We're really still in the early stages. We have our merch store up and we just got our tax exemption approved like within the last month, which, hey, by the way, Jake, but it's been really good and rewarding. And I think that being able, like, I would say that that's kind of one of my strengths, because musicians and artists and fans are people that I know how to talk to because I did it for so long in my band.
Yeah.
And that's like that's my people.
It's your mission field, kind of. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that this is I think people should focus their activism on their strengths.
Yeah.
And this is one of them. And like I said, I'm going to focus a lot more on this next year. We're doing a lot of stuff with them next year with Punks for Liberty. I also have, like I said, another thing that I'm doing that's going to be like, in my opinion, astronomically bigger than anything I've ever done. And I feel like that is going to be better than anything I could contribute with a political party or any other outlet as of right now.
Yeah.
So
I kind of know what you're
But,
alluding to, but we're going to keep it just mysterious and unspoken for the audience for now.
Yeah. It'll be cool. I think people will be able to appreciate it and they'll really like it.
As you may know, the team at Podsworth Media has been working with me for a long time, producing this show and most of the other shows at the Christians for Liberty Network. And a big part of that has been using the Podsworth app to make our audio sound clean, level, and professional, even when the raw recordings at times can be kind of super sketchy. Like this one you're listening to right now, actually. Believe it or not, this recording was that bad before I ran it through the Podsworth app. And you can hear the full before and after demo for yourself at the link in the description. The app recently got a huge update, and it's better than ever. So good, in fact, that it can take almost any atrocious voice recording and make it sound great. So here's how it works. It removes background noise, whether you got fans or other things going on around you while you're recording. It cuts down on plosives when you don't have a pop filter on and your P's and B's can just make a really, not very pleasant sound in the microphone. It fixes clipping when your gain is too high, or if you're just like me and you get really animated about something, so you have to yell really loud. And so that helps out with that. It removes clicks and pops. It reduces reverb. It improves tone, and it levels out all the dialogue so you don't get these crazy volume jumps and everything is just consistent. Now, using it is really simple. You just go to podsworth.com, click Get Started, and then you drag and drop your audio files, or if you're using your smartphone, just do it right from your smartphone's browser. Customize your settings if you want, but honestly, the default works great for most podcast recordings. Best part here, enter code LCI50 to get 50% off your first order. And again, no account needed, just your email and payment, and you'll get a download link in your inbox with the cleaned up audio files. It's perfect for podcasts, YouTube videos, sermons, audiobooks, you name it. If your recording sounds rough, the Podsworth app can make it not only listenable, but professional. And remember, when you use the code LCI50, you'll get half off your first order, and you'll be supporting this show and the rest of the Christians for Liberty Network.
Punks for Liberty. So you're appealing to, punk rock, punk culture. And, now traditionally, maybe not so much these days, but traditionally, punk culture and punk rock bands were seen as like anti-authoritarian, right? Now over time, Rage Against the Machine turned into Rage for the Machine. But, the original spirit, I think, is still, and even, I think most true punks today and most, grassroots punk culture is anti-authoritarian, but it can often be, seen as anti-religious too. So, is there any kind of tension there or problems, in terms of reconciling your, sort of punk identity and activism, with your Christianity? How do you navigate that?
I think Christianity is pretty punk rock, man. I think it's countercultural. I think that you talked about Jesus Wept. He was the original emo dude. Like he proved it was not a phase. Sorry, but I know. Sorry, I stole it. But
it's okay.
I think that I don't know. I don't have any problems reconciling like what I'm doing with my Christianity. I'm also not trying to reconcile it for other people either, because to some people, secular music, even Christian hard rock, metal, stuff like that, I think could probably potentially be a stumbling block. And I think people should act according to their own convictions that God's given them on that. But for me, like I said, these are my people. They're people I know how to talk to. And I've never had a problem ever being a touring artist, playing major venues like Warped Tour, major festivals with Korn, Stone Sour, Day to Remember. I've never had a problem with my faith. There's never been, no one's had a problem with me because of something religious that I've said or how I prayed at the beginning of a show or something like that. Yeah. No one's ever had an issue with that. I'm sure that people might think in their heads or be like, oh, look at these weirdos, but I've never had it actually addressed with me. So there's that side of it. But I don't know. Like I said, I think that Christianity is pretty punk rock. Like I said, it is. Jesus was a rebel who was countercultural. and at his time. And I think that he wants us to be, what's funny is like punk is countercultural. And then there's probably like the second level that's counterculture. And I think that that's probably where we should be, because like even counterculture movement ends up looking either like no king's protests, or it ends up looking like dudes marching in South Charleston with tiki torches. Like,
Yeah.
it's, you know what I'm saying?
Oh, no,
Like,
I get it. Yeah.
They always think that they're like on the right side. And I think that like we're kind of outside, like we're not of this world. We're not supposed to be part of this system thing. So I think we got to do this from a more like an outside lens of all of that anyways.
So let's get into like, what is, because so obviously I agree with you, but I'm asking leading questions in a way to kind of like help us flesh this out more. Like, what does it mean to be countercultural for Christians, you think specifically? Does that mean that we should be rebellious? Should we be like, rude or even antagonistic towards authority and institutions? I think on one hand, we see examples where Jesus was, certainly had harsh words and even like would flip tables and chase people out of the temple. But there's also, is there a concern that like we're going to turn people away if we're, I don't know, too radical or too aggressive or too brash? I think there's on one hand this call to be countercultural, and then there's worry like, are we going to be a stumbling block to people? Are we going to, I think libertarians have their own, version of this, right? It's kind of like that tension between, there's always this tension, I think, in both of these contexts between like preach the raw, radical, pure, unadulterated message and just be, 100% all the time versus secret sensitive, which does have like, Paul says, I have become all things to all people, right? So I don't know, there's a little bit of a tension there. And I'd be curious to hear you speak to that in terms of like, how do you navigate that tension? And like, what is, so punk rock is, countercultural. And then you said, but there's in your own words, you said that like Christians are called to something beyond that. So, let's try to capture what that means a little bit.
I think that like everyone can play a role that's specifically designed for them to play. And I think that that's up to you to find that, based on how God's convicted you. But I think that, for the most part, I don't know, like I was kind of going to go down like a Romans 12, end of Romans 12 type situation where they're talking about, it's one of my favorite verses in the Bible where the whole part of the chapter was about, how Jews can't eat pork. And if you are going to eat with someone that's Jewish, because you're a Gentile, it might be okay that you're eating pork, but they're Jewish. And if you eat pork in front of someone that's Jewish, that could be a stumbling block to them. And I think that, like I said, we all have a role to play, but we also have to recognize where we are as Christians, if you are a Christian. And I think that the verse that I like to highlight there, and people use this and misconstrue it to just justify all kinds of things. And I'm not trying to do that. But, it says essentially the faith that you have between yourself and God. It's basically God's going to convict you of certain things, right? But the second part of that is blessed is he who doesn't condemn himself in what he approves. And I think that's really important to highlight because yes, God's going to convict you of something different than like if I wanted to have a beer, maybe it's not, I'm not speaking for God here. I'm not like, maybe I'm wrong, but if I wanted to have a beer, maybe it's not wrong. If somebody else wanted to have a beer, maybe it is wrong. That's what their conviction was. Like, but like I said, putting yourself in that context of that passage, if I'm going to my father, like my father's never has had problems with alcohol. But let's say hypothetically, my father was a lifelong alcoholic. I'm not going to go to his house and drink a beer because it could be a stumbling block for him. And it could affect his life and his spiritual growth. But I think that God convicts people and puts people in places of their life where they're able to make an impact and where they're able, like everyone's personal situation is going to be different in how they're able to interact with their community and with the people around them. And I do think that like there's a conviction inside of you that'll show you the way you're supposed to go with that. but blessed is he who doesn't condemn himself in what he approves. Just be careful. Like pray about things and figure out where you're supposed to be. And I think that's a really important part of that. For me, like I said, I'm doing Punks for Liberty. For some people, like I was raised fundamental Baptist, they believe that secular music is sinful. They believe it's the devil's music. And for them, it might be actually sinful to listen to it. If they're convicted about that, if God's convicted them that this is could be a stumbling block, well, like they shouldn't listen to it. You know what I mean? For me, God put me in those positions to be able to talk to people that are in that community and in that area. And I've tried to use that to my advantage to, like I said, I've talked about things like liberty and stuff, but, I think in terms of like the overall thing, I think that, everywhere we go, we're supposed to be walking examples of Christ, and none of us live up to that expectation, and we never could. But I do think it's like really, really important to, no matter where you are, no matter who you're around, I think that if you are reflecting that and you're trying to do that you're not, there's no way you can be in the wrong with that. Like just, like keeping constant prayer about it, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So
I
sorry, I took that in like a different direction probably than I probably should have. But
it's the right direction. I think that we often want to boil things down to like a perfect formula, but it is kind of a tension we have to navigate with guidance from the Holy Spirit. I would say, though, that there are probably times in history and times in individual lives where we steer too far into wanting to be bold and principled with our faith that we become stumbling blocks and we're not actually drawing people to Christ. I do think, though, that in general right now,
we can be too aggressive with these things, man. We can definitely be too aggressive with our opinions. This is kind of why I had mentioned the word apologetics earlier, because like I said, I was a missionary for 2 years, and a lot of that is, fundamental Baptist Christians, they're not really very connected to the world either. They kind of live in their own world. They don't really know how to talk to people that well.
How much of this is distinguishing between different, like, sometimes I think it's not an either or, it's just about, we have to identify the who, right? So when we're talking about people that we're trying to evangelize, people we're trying to preach the gospel to, I think those are the people, and this is just actually emulating Christ. Those are the people that we're supposed to, we're supposed to reach them by serving them, right? Like Christ is the example of the servant leader. But who did Jesus have the harshest words for? The ones in authority, especially his own religious authorities. And I think that oftentimes we as Christians, we kind of invert that. And I am like one of the most conservative Christians you'll ever meet. Like I hold, pretty much all traditional, what's considered, traditional, at least, right-wing views on marriage and sexuality, and, waiting till marriage to have sex, and thinking that marriage is between a man and a woman. And I'm not pro LGBT or anything like that. But at the same time, I think that we as Christians have had this thing where we're too focused on calling out sin in private individuals, especially sexual sins. And we have this obsession with everyone. I was on your wife's show before she was your wife, Brandy, and we had a conversation about Christian purity culture, which was really one of my favorite conversations still. We get to talk about things I don't often get to talk about, and just in my own personal testimony and walk. But there's this obsession with sexual ethics and purity culture in our society, which I'm not saying we should completely abandon, but I think we approach it in the wrong way. And then we're too comfortable. We punch at sinners, but we cuddle with power and empire, and all the wrong things. And we have that inverted. We should be, not soft on sin, but soft towards sinners, to say hey, you're caught in sin, but we're going to reach you with love and point you to a better way. But, we struggle against, rulers and principalities and the forces of darkness in heavenly places. And we act but that doesn't apply when it's cloaked in red, white, and blue.
Yeah, right. It's kind of it is kind of like one of those examine the plank in your own eye before calling out the speck in someone else's. It's almost kind of like that, And I think that we all do that from time to time. But, you're right. Like everyone tends to cling to, these other things. And obviously like these worldly empires or cultures, or they've all got their little golden calves that they try to cling to. And there's a really, like, I think if we're, like I said, if we're trying to emulate the life of Christ, that if you can look at the world and try to like just pull yourself back from that, I don't know, man. Like if anyone out there has like been in the political party mindset, it can just be really toxic. It literally makes you feel almost like you're better than other people, and you are. I'm just kidding. But no,
Well,
I'm just kidding.
I think like if Jesus could come down today, and if he was around a bunch of conservative evangelicals, he would tell the story of the Good Samaritan, but the Good Samaritan would be like the good Democrat, right? Or the good the good blue-haired leftist LGBTQ person, right? And then you'd ask like, a conservative pundit and a Christian preacher, and then the LGBTQ blue-haired leftist, all walked by, a person in need and who helped them, right? And the same way, they could go to the Democrats at the No Kings protests and be like, give to like, a religious, a social justice warrior and like Barack Obama, and then like the third person could be like a guy in a MAGA hat, right? Like we all have these blinders where we've been conditioned by certain cultural norms and our group identities that we take on to just like other
it's polarizing, man.
Yeah.
I mean, social media just makes it even worse too, man. Like they choose what you're allowed to see. The corporate media does its own thing of choosing what you're allowed to see, but the social media, the algorithms all do the same type of thing. We can call it, it is, but
and there's this tension, like, there's stuff in the Bible that says like to, be blameless before others and not be a stumbling block. But there's a slippery slope between that and respectability politics, which is not the path to life either, right? Like that can be like chasing, because that can just turn into like you're seeking the approval of man.
Sure.
And so I think that's kind of the danger. I think, so we're running short on time, but I want to ask you one more question on this kind of line, and then ask you like one more, like kind of a closing question about Punks for Liberty and where people can find you and support anything you're doing.
Okay.
But, we talked about, Jesus is the original emo, right? Because like Jesus, like I love this story, like, it's the shortest verse in the Bible, but it's so impactful because like, God himself, a person of the Trinity, of the triune God, came down, walked the earth, had already been saying, Lazarus is dying, but I'm going to go and I'm going to, bring him back to life. But then when I forget if it was his sister or his wife comes and just like is crying, like, Lord, if you have been here, how could you not have been here? You could have saved him. And he's just like so moved by the moment that he starts weeping too. Just because like, despite the fact that he knows he's about to go and heal him, like he is, connecting with us, with humanity on such a personal level because he lived a human life. He was fully human and fully God. And so, God, he wasn't compartmentalized in that way, right? He was a fully unified being in that moment. And so, this whole like idea of being punk and being emo, it's like, we're very in touch with our feelings, and we're passionate, and we're willing to, I think real men cry. I cry in front of my kids and my wife all the time. I'm cheesy. I cry at like movies, like good Disney movies or, good family movies when stuff happens. I'm kind of sappy like that, but then there's also times where Jesus is like, he's not all soft. He's flipping tables, like he's fashioning whips. So, here's a question that I'd like to get you to answer. If Jesus was walking today, who would he be weeping for? And whose tables would he be flipping?
I mean, pretty much like, I think that like the tables that were being flipped, I think that definitely, I think that like a lot of it would be like, I think he'd probably at the White House, honestly, man. Like he'd be flipping tables at the White House for sure. And I think a lot of probably political powerhouses. And I think that like political stuff is just like one side of it, but I think he really was much more offended by people using the house of the Lord to sell and gamble and do all this stuff inside of, the a holy space. And I think that there's definitely a lot of that goes on today, like in the church and outside the church, people selling the front row seats to go to see certain televangelists.
Oh,
You know
yeah.
what I mean? Like that's pretty wild too, that it's happening. And honestly, I try to say that I'm surprised, but it's never ended. This has always been a thing.
Or Trump rallies where he's signing Bibles.
Yeah, that was pretty wild too. And then the second half of that question, whose table's really flipping? What was the other half of that question?
Who would he be weeping for?
Right now, man, I mean, I'm pretty white-pilled for society, for the world, and I think that we should be, because we are called to a higher kingdom, and God has this under control. In terms of like who he'd be weeping for, I do think that there's a lot of hurting people in the world right now. There's a lot of starving people that are hurting. There's a lot of families that live in your community, in our communities, that are struggling every day. I was just at a celebration of life this weekend of someone who passed away of cancer, who left behind a 12-year-old kid. And there's a lot of suffering in the world. And I know that God can feel that. God knows what's happening.
Yeah.
And we tend to focus on ourselves when a lot of this stuff is happening, but there's a lot more going on, and I think that there's plenty of things that God would be weeping about.
Yeah.
In that vicinity.
I think he's,
and I'm trying to do better about recognizing this, because I walk by people that are struggling, and for a long time, they're suffering and you don't know it. And it was like this when I was playing music too. You never know who's suffering and struggling with something deeply personal that might be on the edge of their life and considering taking it. You know what I mean? That's a normal thing in the alternative music community. And I think that like being a light and bringing them hope and showing them that there's another way, I think that that's brought out a lot of people out of those dark places.
Yeah, there's such a beautiful intersection between all of this, and like music is such an underrated tool. I do worship at my church. I'm actually going to be doing worship at a men's retreat this weekend at the time of when we're recording this, and it's just man, music is. I think like there's so many arguments for the existence of God, but I feel like music is one of there's not like a formal argument that any theologians made about music being a proof for God's existence. But for me, that's just one of those I don't know how people can not understand that our emotions and our reaction to music and how music moves us on this such foundational level.
Very spiritual.
Yeah, it's very spiritual. Yeah. And that can go both ways, right? I think there is music that can be harmful in terms of it can move people in a negative way, because
it can hurt your soul.
Right, exactly.
Sure.
So Ben, there's so much more we could talk about, and I'm sure we'll be getting you back on the show for follow-up conversations. But how can people, if they want to learn more about Punks for Liberty and they want to get involved with that, find that? And then also, where can people follow you so that they can be apprised as to other things that you have coming down the pipeline?
Sure. So not Punks for Liberty, you can find that at punksforliberty.org. We're also on Twitter, Punks for Liberty. And I would say if you're interested in following me on Twitter, that's cool. Weir 4, the number 4, Liberty is my handle. And you can find me on Facebook, I guess, Ben Weir. Not a whole lot of interesting stuff happens there. I'm not on there very often, but I definitely have some really cool announcements coming up. And I think that y'all will like it a lot. I think it's going to be great for everyone. Yeah. So,
well, I'm excited. Everyone who follows me should definitely follow Ben. I think Ben he's one of the most thoughtful, energetic, passionate, Christ-loving and centered people I know. And I'm just really glad that we were able to finally get you on the show to have hopefully the first of many future conversations, and just be praying for everything you're doing for it to bear fruit. I thank you, my audience, for tuning in and listening to this conversation. Make sure that you like this video and subscribe to the channel if you're new and you haven't already subscribed. And of course, check out the Libertarian Christian Institute at libertarianchristians.com. And conclude, as I always conclude, by saying, live at peace, live for Christ, take care.
The Biblical Anarchy podcast is a part of the Christians for Liberty Network, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. If you love this podcast, it helps us reach more with a message of freedom when you rate and review us on your favorite podcast apps and share with others. If you want to support the production of the Biblical Anarchy podcast, please consider donating to the Libertarian Christian Institute at biblicalanarchypodcast.com, where you can also sign up to receive special announcements and resources related to biblical anarchy. Thanks for tuning in.